On the morning of June 24th, 2011, the flags at a hospital on the Upper East Side of Manhattan flew at half-mast for a woman that almost no one outside its walls had ever seen in person. She had lived in that hospital room for 20 years. Voluntarily. She had checked herself in, paid her bill without question every single day, and never left. She owned 3 mansions. A 23-room Fifth Avenue apartment. A California oceanfront estate with a ballroom large enough to hold a symphony. A Connecticut property sprawling across 52 acres. Combined, they were worth over $300 million. 40 servants maintained them. Around the clock. For decades. Not one of those servants had ever seen their employer walk through the door. Her name was Huguette Clark. She had everything this world considers power. And she chose to disappear from all of it. This is the story of why. Quick pause before we go any further into this story. Documentaries like this one take obsessive research to make. And I do it without a studio or a network behind me. Just me and you. We have one goal this month. 1,000 subscribers. And right now we are close, but not there yet. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different. So don't be the person who watched, felt something, and kept scrolling. Hit subscribe. Be one of the originals, the ones who were here before this took off. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. We're so close. Let's get there together. Now back to Huguette. Chapter 1. The Man Who Built the Empire. To understand Huguette Clark, you must first understand the universe she was born into. And that universe was built by a single, relentless man. William Andrews Clark did not stumble into wealth. He manufactured it, systematically, with the kind of focused ambition that leaves no room for sentiment. He arrived in Montana Territory in the 1860s with almost nothing, a schoolteacher's salary and a merchant's eye. Within a decade, he controlled banking, mining, and transportation across the territory. Within 2, he was one of the wealthiest men in the United States. He was not simply mining copper. He was constructing an empire vertically, owning the mines, the smelters, the railroads that carried the ore, and the banks that financed the entire operation. What Clark extracted from the earth in a single quarter exceeded what most American families accumulated across 3 generations. The number was not the point. The control was the point. He entered the Senate. He built cities. He commissioned entire railroad lines through deserts simply because he could. His fortune at its peak was estimated at $250 million, the equivalent of several billion in today's currency. But for all his dominion over systems and markets, there was one domain Clark could not control. The private life he kept sealed from public view. At the age of 68, William Clark married a 28-year-old woman named Anna LaChapelle, quietly, secretly, in Europe, and kept the marriage hidden for 2 years. Huguette was born in 1906. She was the daughter of a man who had spent his entire life building walls around his vulnerabilities. She would spend hers doing the same. The empire was built. The walls were already going up. But no one, not even Clark himself, could have predicted what his daughter would eventually wall herself inside of. Chapter 2. The Palace and Its Purpose. In 1904, William Clark completed construction on what would become one of the most talked-about private residences in American history. The mansion at 962 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan stood 9 stories tall and contained 121 rooms. It had 4 art galleries, a pipe organ built into the walls, a theater, a gymnasium, and a swimming pool. Its construction cost the equivalent of tens of millions in today's dollars. Critics called it grotesque. Neighbors called it an assault. Clark called it a home. But it was never really a home. Every gilded cornice, every marble column, every vaulted ceiling was a statement directed outward. At rivals, at society, at a city that had not yet decided whether it would accept a copper baron from Montana as one of its own. The house was not built for living. It was built for declaration. 121 rooms for a family of 4 said everything Clark wanted said, in a voice that could not be ignored. Young Huguette grew up inside this declaration. She was raised in rooms designed to impress strangers, surrounded by art collected to signal taste, attended by servants whose function was to maintain the performance. Love, in the Clark household, arrived wrapped in the language of acquisition. Affection was demonstrated through objects. Closeness was expressed through proximity to beautiful things. It was a language Huguette absorbed completely. And it was the only language she would ever truly speak. She was a child learning to translate emotion into possession. What she could not yet know was that possession, taken far enough, becomes its own kind of prison. Chapter 3. Everything taken, nothing left. In 1919, Huguette Clark's older sister Andre died of meningitis. She was 16 years old. Huguette was 12. There is no clinical record of what that loss did to Huguette at that age. There are no diaries, no letters written in grief. What exists instead is the behavioral record of everything that followed. And behavioral records, if you know how to read them, speak louder than any confession. Huguette withdrew. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would register as crisis to the adults around her. She simply began constructing a smaller and smaller perimeter around herself. A process so gradual that no one identified it as a pattern until the perimeter had shrunk to the size of a single hospital room. 6 years after Andre's death, William Clark died. The architect of the empire, the man whose ambition had defined every room Huguette had ever occupied, was gone. She was 18. She inherited a share of a fortune so vast it required a legal team simply to account for it. And she had no idea what to do with any of it. She married briefly. A man named William Gower, in 1928. The marriage lasted less than a year. No public explanation was ever offered. She simply ended it and retreated further inward, back toward the estate, back toward the objects, back toward the rooms that could not leave her the way people kept leaving her. The pattern was already forming with terrible clarity. First Andre, then her father, then the marriage. Every time Huguette reached toward something living, it vanished. And so, slowly, methodically, she stopped reaching toward anything that could. She had learned the lesson that grief teaches when it arrives too early and too often. Love is a liability. Objects are reliable. Rooms do not die. And so she began filling them, then guarding them, then finally, inexplicably, abandoning them entirely. Chapter 4. The machinery of beautiful emptiness. By the 1950s, Huguette Clark had stopped living in her properties. Not abruptly. She did not announce a departure or explain an absence. She simply began spending longer and longer periods away, until the away became permanent and the properties became something other than homes. They became projects. Her instructions to the staff were precise and unwavering. Maintain everything in first-class condition. Change nothing. Replace the flowers on schedule. Tune the piano. Keep the silver polished. Air the rooms. Repair anything that showed wear. The estates must be kept exactly as they were. Not for her return, which she never planned, but because the alternative was to admit that something had ended. And Huguette Clark did not admit endings. The mathematics of this decision were staggering. The annual cost of maintaining Bellascardo, her Santa Barbara estate overlooking the Pacific, exceeded $1 million per year at its peak. A figure that included a full-time staff of caretakers, groundskeepers, and housekeepers whose sole professional purpose was to preserve a property their employer had not visited in decades. The Connecticut estate, Le Beau Chateau, required similar investment. The Fifth Avenue apartment ran continuously on its own maintenance budget. Across all three properties, roughly 40 full-time employees reported to work every day. They cut the grass on lawns no one walked across. They replaced light bulbs and chandeliers that illuminated rooms no one entered. One staff member, in a detail so precise it borders on surreal, maintained a small outbuilding on the Bellascardo grounds that had originally been constructed as a playhouse for a child. The child had grown up and disappeared into a hospital room in Manhattan. The playhouse was cleaned and maintained on a weekly schedule regardless. The total expenditure across the decades of maintained emptiness ran into the tens of millions. Independent assessors later estimated that Huguette spent upward of $30 million simply to preserve 3 homes she would never sleep in again. To anyone operating within the logic of the world, this was madness. To Huguette Clark, it was the only rational response to a world that kept taking things from her. If she could not stop loss, she could at least freeze time. She could pay people to make sure that everything remained exactly as it was. She could purchase the illusion of permanence. $30 million to stop time. And it still wasn't working. Because while the mansion stayed frozen, Huguette herself was changing. And no amount of money could preserve what was happening to her inside that hospital room. Chapter 5. The richest woman in the worst room. In 1991, Huguette Clark checked herself into the 5th floor of New York Presbyterian Hospital on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She was 85 years old. She told the staff she was coming in for treatment of a skin condition. She never left. For the next 20 years, she occupied a standard private room. Not a suite, not a specially renovated floor, not a wing renamed in her honor. A room. With a hospital bed, a window overlooking a courtyard, and a television. She decorated it modestly with a few personal photographs and some of the antique dolls she had been collecting for decades. She paid her hospital bill every day without complaint. The daily rate ran to approximately $800, which sounds significant until you calculate that her net worth at the time was estimated at between $300 and $400 million. The hospital bill was a rounding error, but she paid it gladly because the room gave her something the mansions had stopped giving her long ago: control over who could enter. The nurses on her floor grew fond of her. She was, by all accounts, unfailingly polite, quietly witty, and entirely lucid. She painted watercolors. She played with her doll collection. She made phone calls. She received a carefully selected handful of visitors. She ate her hospital meals from a tray. When Huguette finally agreed to see a physician after an extended period of avoiding medical examination, the clinical notes recorded something that stopped the attending nurses cold. Despite owning some of the most valuable residential real estate in the country, despite a net worth that could have purchased entire city blocks, the woman in the bed before them presented with the physical condition of someone who had been living in poverty. Malnourished, pale, fragile in a way that wealth was supposed to prevent. One of the wealthiest women in America looked, in the clinical language of her own chart, like someone who had nothing. Because in the ways that mattered to her, she had decided that nothing was safer. $300 million in assets. $800 a day for a standard hospital room. And nurses who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The wealth was real. The life being lived inside it was something else entirely. And the people who had figured that out were already circling. Chapter 6. When Love Costs $100 million. In isolation, Huguette Clark did not stop giving. She simply redirected everything she had toward the people who came to her, rather than chasing the ones who had left. Her nurse, a woman named Hadassah Perry, received gifts from Huguette over the course of their relationship that totaled more than $30 million. Cash gifts, property, cars, college tuition for Perry's children, wire transfers on birthdays, wire transfers on no occasion at all. The gifts arrived so regularly and in such quantities that Perry's family's net worth was transformed entirely over the course of 20 years by the generosity of a single hospital patient. Huguette's attorney, her accountant, her goddaughter, each received gifts of significant and sometimes astonishing size. A doll purchased at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars. A property transferred for a fraction of its market value. A check written on what appeared to most observers to be an impulse, for an amount that would take an average person decades to earn. The people around Huguette understood, with varying degrees of self-awareness, that they were the recipients of something that was not quite generosity and not quite transaction. Huguette had no language for love except money. She had grown up in a household where affection arrived in the form of objects, where closeness was demonstrated through acquisition. She was not being exploited, exactly. She understood what she was doing. But she was also clearly purchasing the one thing her 3 empty mansions could not provide: presence. Every gift was a question with a price tag attached. Will you stay? The answers, in the form of continued visits, continued phone calls, continued voices through the hospital room door, were the only warmth she allowed herself. $30 million to one nurse. Tens of millions more distributed across a small circle of people whose proximity she had purchased one gift at a time. The fortune was not being preserved. It was being spent. And the people who were supposed to prevent that were watching it happen. And some of them were helping themselves along the way. Chapter 7. The machine eating itself. By the time the legal complications surrounding Huguette Clark's estate became fully visible to the public, the fortune was in a state of accelerating dissolution that no single party had caused, but many had contributed to. The IRS had a claim. The state of California had a claim. The estate taxes alone, calculated across the value of 3 properties, an art collection, and decades of accumulated financial instruments, ran into the tens of millions. Lawyers on multiple sides of multiple disputes were billing hourly. The hospital was still collecting $800 per day. The will itself became the center of a legal battle that illustrated, with painful precision, how completely Huguette had been separated from any conventional understanding of her own situation. She had signed 2 wills. The first, written years earlier, directed the bulk of her estate to blood relatives. Distant cousins, nieces and nephews of varying degrees, people she had not seen in decades, but who carried the Clark name forward. The second will, signed just weeks before her death, redirected enormous portions of that inheritance toward the nurses, the attorneys, and the caregivers who had occupied her hospital room world. The relatives contested immediately. The legal proceedings that followed consumed years and millions of dollars in fees. Money drawn directly from the estate being fought over. The fortune was not crashing. It was not lost in a bad investment or a market collapse. It was dissolving methodically, in the way that fortunes dissolve when there is no one at the center holding them together. Huguette Clark had spent 50 years paying to maintain 3 houses she would never enter. And in the end, the machinery she had set in motion, the staff, the lawyers, the hospital, the gifts, the disputed wills, became the very mechanism that consumed what remained. The trap was mathematical and inescapable. The more she paid to stay hidden, the more her fortune was redirected by the people her hiding made necessary. The machine had been eating itself for decades. Now everyone could see the teeth. Chapter 8. What remains when everything is gone? Huguette Clark died on May 24, 2011. She was 104 years old. The hearse that arrived 2 days later at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx carried a woman who, for the last 2 decades of her life, had been almost entirely invisible to the world she still technically owned a significant portion of. The legal settlement that eventually resolved the competing claims against her estate was announced in 2012. The relatives received a portion. The nurse received a portion, reduced from what the second will had specified. A foundation was established in Huguette's name to preserve Bellisgardo as a center for the arts. The Santa Barbara estate she had last walked through sometime in the 1950s would now be open to the public, its rooms finally occupied by strangers she would never have to face. The 40 servants scattered. The properties were inventoried, assessed, and gradually transferred or sold. The flowers stopped being replaced. What Huguette Clark left behind was not simply an estate. It was a case study in what happens when the capacity for human connection is permanently redirected toward the management of beautiful, empty space. She had the resources to do anything, to go anywhere, to fill those 121 rooms with noise and life, and the kind of accumulated human experience that fortunes are supposed to enable. She chose silence instead. She chose control over connection. She chose the room she could lock from the inside over the mansions she could not bear to inhabit. The quiet, in the end, outlasted everything else, including the fortune that was supposed to prevent it. Huguette Clark had $300 million and chose a hospital room. That tells you everything about what money can and cannot buy. If this documentary made you think, subscribe. We are this close to 1,000 subscribers this month, and every single one matters. Don't be the person who watched the whole thing and disappeared, just like Huguette did. Drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Tell me which part of her story hit different. I read every single one. There are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about people who had everything and made choices no one could explain. Be here for them. Subscribe. Comment. And I'll see you on the next one.